So again, welcome to U of T Talks and to our February talk, which is to engineer, be human. Now, I am very fortunate that this evening I have the ability to introduce to you Dr. Philip Asare, who is an assistant professor in the Division of Engineering Science and the Institute for Studies in Transdisciplinary Engineering Education and Practice, or ISTEP, an institute created to drive change in how we prepare future engineering leaders. His teaching within EngSci and ISTEP focuses on engineering design and transdisciplinary competencies. Professor Asare sees engineering as an activity geared towards human goals, full of rich and interesting stories of how particular ideas or products came to be. His approach to engineering and engineering education focuses this view of engineering as a human activity and the implication of this perspective for engineering education and practice. A significant theme of Philip's teaching and projects focuses on how we educate engineers to operate in the complex socio-technical world, particularly how we create an engineering community that is diverse, inclusive, equitable, and the related benefits for society, in such an engineering community. Born and raised in Ghana, Philip relishes opportunities to incorporate his multicultural background into his work and to share his background with others. Welcome, Dr. Asare. We are so happy to have you here.
Thanks, Lydia. So I guess I'm going to go ahead and share screen and start. Just checking if you all can see screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I'm going to start by introducing my colleague who I do this work with, and it felt odd to do this talk without highlighting her on the talk as well. Dr. Elif Misiolu is a colleague of mine from Bucknell University, and we work very closely on a lot of what I'm going to talk about. We actually have this tradition of when one is giving the talk without the other to keep the other's picture in the talk. So you're going to see her popping up on slides, especially the slides that she would usually do. So I'll try to channel my inner Aleph as we get to those slides and we go along. And I think this fits with the theme of engineering being a human activity and people working together on various things. So I want to start with the thought that we engineer parts of our lives every day. And if you've ever talked to students in my class, I like things to be interactive. So I'm going to start with a question and you can post some of your answers in the chat. So just think about some decisions that you make regularly on a daily basis. And what are some of the factors do you consider in those decisions that you make every day about your life and how you're going to go about it? You can throw some of your answers in the chat as questions so I can see them, but I'll give you about a minute or two to do that. So you can use the Q&A feature to post some stuff. Okay, so I see outfit choices, what to eat. Okay, great. When to do homework. Okay, that's a good one. Cool. Exercise, tests, homework, how to get to school, how to spend time. All right, I see quite a bit of stuff. Using Google Calendar to plan the day, what to wear with the weather. This is interesting because the examples I have on my slides are related to many of the things that you all are talking about, right? So your daily schedule, how you're going to go about your day, what you're going to wear, especially given the weather. It is really cold. It has been pretty cold in Toronto recently. So I have to think carefully about what I wear, especially if I'm planning to step out, and also meals, right? What you're going to eat and balance that with what you want going into your body and the outcomes there. So thanks a lot for participating and answering those questions. So given those examples, I want to throw out a broad definition of engineering that we're going to use throughout the rest of the talk. It's a very broad definition, so not all my colleagues will agree with it. But for me, engineering is the process that leads to what we call artifacts, things, results that meet specific goals, right? So you want to eat and sustain your body within constraints, right? So there are some things that you may not have access to. and also thinking about the available resources, right? So all these things go together. And usually it's to solve a perceived problem or to increase quality of life in that sense. So I want to talk about some examples of how various people have engineered parts of their lives and some of the things that they led to. So this is an example I came across looking for something for one of my classes about work that women and girls have done in engineering. And this is about a young lady who had a grandfather who was had Parkinson's and so can't hold a coffee cup and teacups and was always spilling his drink. And so she decided to invent a cup for her granddad that would allow him to drink without spilling. And so she worked on it, and her dad supported her, and they put together some designs and actually made a cup called the Kangaroo Cup and created a company around it and got it manufactured and put it out there for others who might be experiencing similar situations. So that's one example of things that come out of our personal lives that lead to innovations and engineering work. The other example is something you may not be familiar with because it's a backstory, but you are familiar with the effects. Most of you have a smartphone. All of you are joining online, which means you're receiving information through the internet, which is a communication technology. But a lot of the way this communication technology works is based on something called Viterbi algorithm, named after a man, Andrew Viterbi. Now, Viterbi actually invented this algorithm for different reasons. So Viterbi was a professor, like me, at the University of California in Los Angeles. And in March of 1996, he had yet another group of students who were struggling trying to understand information theory, which is the course that he taught. And information theory has to do with how we gather, mathematics of how we gather and move information across the world. And some of that feeds into the engineering of communication systems. So his goal was to simplify the material and help his students understand the theory better. Part of doing that was developing this new algorithm, which he thought was a simpler way of communicating the material and what's actually happening in the mathematics. But then he realized, after publishing the algorithm, because that's what academics do, we like to share our work, that it had uses and that you could actually implement it and use it for various applications. So one of the first things that they did was work with satellite companies to use it for trucks that were moving goods around the world. And this technology actually exists today. So that's how some trucks are tracked around the world in terms of moving goods. And it uses satellite technology. What the Viterbi algorithm does very simply is it allows you to get the information from a very small signal, which is kind of like whispering. So it allows you to whisper basically across the world, in the world of signals, and still get the message across without having to shout so loudly, and also to be mixed in with other signals and other noise. What then happened was this eventually led to the company Qualcomm, which is a huge telecommunications company and technologies that have revolutionized the mobile industry. So if you're used to getting things on your mobile phone and going on Instagram and TikTok and all these spaces, you can thank Viterbi for making some of that possible. But it all started because he was trying to teach better. Other example that I will give has to do with a lifestyle brand. And this is an example that I got from my colleague, which is why she's popping up on the slide. But it has to do with Allison Phoenix, who is a track and field athlete from the US. And in 2018, when her contract came up for renewal, she used to be with Nike. Nike gave her a lowball offer because they thought she was getting old. And at the time, I think she was pregnant and was having a kid. And they felt like she wasn't going to be a top performing athlete anymore based on her circumstances. So they decided not to give her a pretty sizable contract. Allison didn't quite like that, so decided to part with Nike. And in 2021, decided to launch our own shoe brand, and actually wore that shoe at the 2021 Olympics and actually performed really well. So proved Nike wrong, right? So this is people innovating to challenge the norms, right? And engineering plays a big role in innovation in terms of getting an idea into practice and into useful technologies. So the next thing I want to talk about is the title of the talk a little bit. You'll notice that it's this weird to engineer with parentheses and a comma be human. And what we're actually trying to say there is we're saying two different things that are very similar. So it plays on the use of parentheses in the English language, where the thing in parentheses is optional. You can read it or not. And in this case, when you read it one way, to engineer be human, something the interpretation there for us is engineering is something humans do, and I'll tell you where that comes from later. And then to engineer be human, the interpretation there is in order to engineer, you have to embrace your humanity and others' humanity. So gonna switch gears a little bit, continuing to channel my inner Aleph and talk about the first interpretation, which is engineering is something that humans do. And this is a diagram and a concept that we've been building over time that tries to capture this idea. So we start with the world, right? The world has humans. There's an environment, and there are a lot of human-made structures. Some of them are physical, some of them are social, but they exist. So you can have physical things like money and cell phones, and we can also have social structures like the legal system and government that humans have made. And then engineers who are human beings come into this picture and use some of these tools, and they go about doing their engineering. And what results from that are new human-made structures. Some of them are physical and some of them are still social, right? So we can get new social structures out of things that are engineered, right? So for example, because we have the car, we now have traffic laws and the way in which people move and interact with the traffic system, right? Which didn't used to exist before things like cars came along, right? So often the physical structures come with social structures as well around them. The other thing to keep in mind is the process is not what I would say disembodied. So the engineering process is influenced by human nature, the people who are actually doing the engineering, the people who are affected by it, and also the existing structures, right? These tell us the resources that are available, what are the constraints, right? So doing engineering in certain countries, there are laws, there are codes, there are things that you have to operate with and get creative within those constraints. So engineering doesn't just happen in a completely free world. And so what happens is these influences kind of shape what we do and the outcomes that we get. The other thing to notice is these human-made structures that I've been referring to have this sort of two ways of existing. In some sense, they are abstract, right? So the concept of law, the concept of health, the concept of government is something we can talk about intellectually in abstract fashion. But they are also embodied. We have real people in government positions who we elect and follow processes to get them there. And there is a justice system with lawyers and judges that enact these things, right? So and you can talk about that for many of the disciplines, even in science, right? We have philosophical and conceptual things, and we have things that are embodied in science and engineering as well. And these embodiments, they create what I would call lenses, which is why we have this picture of glasses, right? And the lenses are biases. They don't tell you the full story all the time. You get one perspective of it. So if you look at things from a science perspective or an engineering perspective or from a political or economic perspective, you're going to be looking at it in a particular way that leaves out some information. But they also have the ability to create effect in the world, right? So these dominoes that we have there are these hands that are taking away and putting things in the world, right? So when we engineer, the most concrete form of engineering we're all familiar with is construction, right? Putting up a building or a design, or putting out something physical, right? So we create those things and they become part of the world. We can also destroy things, which we do from time to time, right? So these ideas can have real effect. The way the legal system operates can constrain or enable people in various ways. And so we have to be mindful of the form in which these structures take. So this is a picture that we've been working on and putting together. It's our way of kind of conceptualizing this complex picture and showing how things are abstract and embodied in the world. And we actually worked with some graphic design students to put this together. So that was fun. But I want to talk a little bit about this idea of human-made structures coming out of what exists and the things that are abstract and embodied with some concrete examples, and how this thing of engineering as a human activity is what human beings do, how that plays out. So I want to start with an example that is close to home for me. I'm originally from Ghana. I grew up there, and in Ghana, there is this thing called mobile money, and a lot of other parts of the world as well. But mobile money is interesting because it started out as barter trading, and barter trading is a significant part of the culture in places like Ghana, where I give you something of value to me in exchange of something of value, and we don't use actual money to trade. So when mobile phones came up for the first time in Ghana, mobile phone plans in Ghana are usually prepaid. So you buy what's called credit or minutes, usually. And for some reason, the cell phone companies allowed people to transfer credits or minutes to each other. And what people used to do would pay for things in credit or loan people credit, and credit became essentially a form of money. So Safaricom and Vodafone and a group of people in Kenya decided to formalize this and actually create a form of money through the mobile phone system. And usually you go to an agent to buy these credits. And so these credits agents became the banks, essentially, where you pay them money, you load credits, and then you can move money now actually in monetary terms to other people. There's now lots of different models of this in a lot of different places. And now you can move money. When I go back home to Ghana, it's fairly easy to pay with mobile money. And these days you can pay with mobile money online, which is really cool. It's a really huge sector in places like that. So this is an example of engineering that has taken advantage of the way the people already operate and the way they understand money and value, and turned it into an interesting technology. So a couple of other examples. The examples aren't always positive. This is something that came to Elif and I through one of our colleagues who's in computer science, about a discussion that a colleague had with the students in class about if you had to design a system that had to tell whether names that were given to it were fake or not. What would you do? How would you develop the system? One example that came up was if the name length is less than 3, then it's probably a fake name. But we all know people with last names or names that might be less than 3 letters long. So that would be a very discriminatory system. And if you thought of this system as sort of an artificial intelligence system, Andrew Ng, who is a huge name in artificial intelligence and machine learning, who started Coursera and is at Stanford. His last name is NG, which is less than 3 letters long. And this AI would have basically decided that his name was fake, which is interesting irony there. And because of assumptions we make in disciplines like computer science, which is a discipline I have some affiliation to, things like this happen. So a lady called Jennifer Null can't put her name into systems because a lot of database systems are designed where null means nothing. It means we're not putting a value there. So if you entered her name into the database, it would just assume that the name doesn't exist. And if you ever went to go back and retrieve it, you would only get maybe the Jennifer from the first name and nothing else for the last name. So there are these assumptions, right? This is an example of how assumptions we make as humans and decisions we make as humans have effect through the technology that we design. And it's important to keep that in mind because these are humans making decisions about technology. Another interesting issue that happens, especially with sensor systems like this one that you'll find in the bathroom, is with optical sensing. A lot of them haven't, especially the cheaper ones, haven't been great with darker toned skin. And this is a post from a disgruntled employee, I believe, from Nigeria, which was on Instagram, talking about how the white paper napkin actually gets things out of the soap dispenser, but can't do it for his hand. And this is probably due to who they tested this on, what assumptions they were making about where it was going to be used. The good news is people recognize this now, and there are a lot of people working on improving these kinds of technologies, especially in healthcare. And in healthcare, there's a lot of optical sensing, especially for non-invasive technologies. And it's important that it works for all people and all skin tones. So again, the biases in the world and the structures that we have and how those affect what we do as engineers. So I want to dig a little bit more into this title that we have, To Engineer Be Human, which I said I was going to do. One message that we're trying to get across, hopefully that you've seen, which is the play on To Err Be Human, is that humans are flawed by nature and we make mistakes. And so because engineers are human, our designs are going to be flawed in some way. Henry Petrosky is an engineer who wrote a whole book about this called To Engineer Is Human, and talking about the role of failure in design. And how we need to sort of acknowledge our humanity in the way we go about design and its limitations, and be mindful of that as we go along. So we started with that, and we're looking for our phrase for our conception of engineering, and didn't really want to repeat what Petrosky had done. And so in one of the conversations Elif and I were having, I was like, well, we could say To Engineer Be Human, because in Ghana, where I'm from, we speak a language called Pidgin English, which is sort of kind of Creole. And if you say something be something in Pidgin, it just means something is something. So we changed the is to be to kind of be, I guess, cool, and use something that came from a cultural perspective, also leaning into that human nature. It also, in some US slang, means the same thing. So that's where To Engineer Be Human came from. And as we were talking about it, we're like, well, if you put a comma next to it, you can also then say To Engineer Be Human, which is the second interpretation that we were looking for. This idea of capturing the humanity in engineering. And so I'm going to switch gears and talk about that a little bit. But to summarize this piece, it is important to recognize the limitations, like I said before, about our humanity and how that leads to what we do as engineers and our ability to respond to problems. And that can help us sort of get ahead of some of the potential pitfalls, and deal with some of the potential consequences there. So switching gears to engineer be human, this discussion is interesting because often the prevailing perception is, in order to be a good engineer, you kind of have to be a little bit like a robot. You have to get rid of your emotions and get rid of that human side of you. And engineering is this kind of objective thing that we do that is devoid of humanity. Clearly, you've noticed by now that I don't agree with that sentiment. But this is a quote from another collaborator of ours, Cal Trenshaw, on why he pivoted out of his technical discipline to engineering education. Because the messaging he was getting from a lot of courses in engineering was, if you're going to be a good engineer, then you don't have to be human. And he wanted to maintain his humanity, or their humanity, and so decided to switch into a discipline that appreciated that. What is interesting was this talk I've given a similar kind of talk, which was titled To Engineer as Human, when I was at Bucknell University in a TEDx talk. And the one comment the last time I checked was this, which on the YouTube channel was that are engineers human beings, right? Because people often feel like engineering is soulless work. But a lot of what engineers do is supposed to be helping humanity. So my message is, or our message is, that the reality is that in order to be a good engineer, to do good engineering, you have to be human. You have to embrace a humanist perspective and embrace the view of humanity, and not run away from it. Both starting with your own humanity and the humanity of others that your work is going to affect. And to talk about how this plays out, Aleph and I like to use the current pandemic, which we all have our opinions on, as a case study, because it's a global crisis that affects everything and it's touching everybody in some way. The big goal is to end the pandemic and to minimize its effects so we can go back to a sort of more normal way of life and sort of less risk management in our everyday activities, more than usual. But there's some constraints, right? There's limited resources, there's politics, there's human nature, and these viruses like to mutate. What is interesting is this is not the first time we've ever had a pandemic. And if you go back to history in the early 1900s when there was a pandemic, you will see similar things to what we're seeing now. There was conversations about masks and how masks could be useful. There were also articles about people getting worked up about masking and a blacksmith striking a health worker and people having very strong opinions about public health guidelines. So we've been here before. And the historical perspective, which is outside the realm of science, it gives us some ideas on how we might approach things as science and engineering catches up. And so we can lean on history and we can lean on social science a little bit. Human behavior is complex, right? So we are still in the pandemic and some technical solutions have arrived, right? We have vaccines, we have some promising looking treatments, and still things aren't yet gone, which means something is missing. And part of that has to do with just human behavior, right? It's complicated the way people are going to react to new solutions and treatments and uptake. It's not straightforward. Right. And so even though technology exists and some solutions exist that are going to be helpful in what we're dealing with in the pandemic, you're still going to get cases of crises because of human behavior. And that is unfortunate, but that is the world that we live in, and that's the world in which engineering and technology has to operate. So this is our last slide, thinking back to the pandemic. It's one of the things you want to highlight is this big picture, right? So this is sort of a projection of how long it's going to take various parts of the world to get to 60% of their population vaccinated. And you can see that some places are not going to make it till at least 2023. And because the world is globalized and connected, you might live in a part of the world where a lot of people are going to be vaccinated. But that doesn't mean the problem goes away for you because of the connected world. And so this is something that we have to think about on a global scale. And you can't just cut the other people and the things they produce out because everybody's dependent on everybody to some extent. So no one country or no one discipline, engineering included, is going to be able to solve this problem. And what it's going to take is us essentially embracing our whole humanity and the tools that we have to bear, including engineering, to address it. And considering various people and their situations and their resources and their abilities in order to do that, and thinking about equity and thinking about inclusion in how we do all of that, which is all part of our humanity. So I and Aleph, who's here in spirit, will leave you with this thought: to engineer, be human, in both senses of the phrase. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Asare. That was a phenomenal talk.